Now, for today's session, our presenter is Darrin Qualman. He is the NFU's Director of Climate Crisis Policy and Action, and the author of the 2019 report, Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis, and the 2019 book, Civilization Critical: Energy, Food, Nature, and the Future. He farmed for 2 decades and has academic degrees in history, biology, and political studies. Thanks for joining us today, Darrin, and you may now go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you very much, Heather. Am I coming through clearly?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks to Heather, and thanks very much to the whole NFU team working behind the scenes. There's a lot of people working on this today. Are my slides showing?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks everyone, thanks for coming. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to present to NFUniversity. It's an interesting change moving from the chair role to the role of presenter. As Heather said, I will be presenting for probably just short of 50 minutes, maybe 45. We're going to do things just slightly different this time. Because this presentation is relatively technical, has some technical terms in it, we want to make sure that nobody gets left behind because they're not following the discussion. So even though we want to minimize the use of the chat function to avoid distraction, if you do have a technical question along the way, if you have a brief question of clarification, maybe something I said that I didn't fully explain, please just type that into the chat function and I will pause from time to time, or someone will interrupt me, and we'll deal maybe 2 or 3 times during the presentation with any of those brief questions of clarification that come up. So we will have the long Q&A session at the end where you can unmute yourself and ask a question. But if during my presentation you have a short question of clarification, just please type that into the chat and we'll pause from time to time to take those. So my presentation today is focused on the NFU's new report on greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture. This is the cover page. It is currently out for proofreading and translation. Ronald Fournier is doing interpretation today, is graciously translating part of it. I should say too that we've taken the extra step, because this report is technical and draws on a lot of sources. We've sent it out for peer review, and that peer review process has included current and former staff at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and also Environment and Climate Change Canada. So we've really gone the extra mile to make sure that every single piece of this is accurate, and Environment and Climate Change Canada has very graciously helped us out in that. So this report is a little more technical than its predecessors. Some of you may know the report, Tackling the Farm Crisis and the Climate Crisis. That gave a really big picture look at emissions and also solutions. And then that was in 2019. We followed that up in 2021 with the Imagine If report, which was a very hopeful report. It invited readers to position themselves in 2030 and look back over the years between 2021 and 2030 and imagine what we could do with agriculture if we took all the steps necessary to move toward sustainability and resilience and low input, low emission systems. And that was last year. This year, we're following up with the emissions report. And this is really an ambitious report to delve deeply into the sources of greenhouse gas emissions in Canada from agriculture. Surprisingly, no one's done this before. Ag and Ag-Food Canada hasn't, Environment and Climate Change Canada haven't. And we just felt a need to really understand in a detailed way what the emission sources were, because that is foundational to allowing us to advise government and create policies on how to reduce those emissions. If we don't understand in a fine-grained way where the emissions are coming from, it's very difficult to design a set of programs moving through the 2020s and 2030s to reduce those emissions. So the core of this report is the analysis of those emissions. And those of you who've known me for a while know that I like graphs. So you won't be surprised to find that the core of this report is a graph. And this presentation today will largely focus on a walkthrough of all the components of that graph. This is the graph here. I'm just going to use a couple of things out of my way so I can see it a little better. Oops. This is the graph here. It has 39 categories of emissions and soil, carbon, atmosphere exchanges in it. And I'm going to start by giving some general observations on what we found when we looked at greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. And then I'm going to walk through each of those emissions and soil carbon exchanges so that people can get a fairly detailed understanding of where the emissions come from in agriculture. I think by the time we're done the presentation today, I think I can be confident in saying you will know more about greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture than 99% of farmers and policymakers, et cetera. So again, the reason we wanted to do this, and it took a tremendous amount of time and effort, was understanding these emissions is really foundational to designing the on-farm action and the government policies and programs to reduce those emissions. So just a little bit of background before I launch in. I don't want to take for granted that we all know the terminology around greenhouse gas emissions. So just for some of you, this is a refresher. There's three main greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is the one that everyone talks about. It's largely from fossil fuel combustion. In agriculture, there's also quite a bit from fertilizer production. We're going to talk a lot about nitrogen fertilizer. Nitrogen fertilizer really is the pivot when it comes to greenhouse gas emission from agriculture. So carbon dioxide is abbreviated CO2. It is the largest contributor to climate warming. Another greenhouse gas is methane. It's abbreviated CH4, one carbon atom, 4 hydrogen atoms, for those of you who remember your chemistry classes. Methane is approximately 30%, or 30 times, I should say, 30 times stronger than CO2 when it comes to trapping warming, trapping heat. Now, the methane emissions are much smaller in terms of tonnage, but each ton of methane is 30% more power, 30 times more powerful when it comes to trapping heat. In agriculture, the main sources of methane are from cattle, from manure, and from natural gas production, from fertilizer. And in the larger economy, other big sources of methane are landfills and the oil and gas production sector. Some of you may know methane and natural gas are more or less the same thing. Most of natural gas is made up of methane. So when we produce oil and natural gas and coal, there's a lot of methane emissions. But in agriculture, it's largely what's called enteric methane from cattle, the methane that comes out of their mouths when they digest grass, and also methane that comes from manure. The third of the three main greenhouse gases is nitrous oxide. That's abbreviated N2O. It's approximately 300 times stronger than CO2 when it comes to trapping heat. Again, the quantities of nitrous oxide are much smaller than CO2, but a given ton of nitrous oxide is 300 times stronger than CO2 when it comes to trapping heat. In agriculture, the main sources of nitrous oxide are from soils, and specifically from soils, the nitrogen metabolism in soils, and that is increased when we add sources of nitrogen like synthetic nitrogen fertilizer or manure. And the fourth term I'll mention is carbon dioxide equivalent. So because each of these greenhouse gases has a different warming potential, rather than talking about tons of carbon dioxide and tons of methane and tons of nitrous oxide, we equate all of those to carbon dioxide equivalent. So a ton of carbon dioxide is 1 ton of CO2e, but 1 ton of methane is 30 tons of CO2e. So that's carbon dioxide equivalent. It's a way of wrapping all of those different gases into one unit of measure, tons of CO2e. So there are 3 main greenhouse gases. That's one way of thinking about this. Another way of thinking about this is, even though there's a lot of different technical categories of emissions from agriculture, they really kind of settle down into 3 main categories. So the first one is fuels and farm input production. So the emissions from diesel, gasoline, from natural gas and propane, and the emissions from making fertilizer, from making machinery, making chemicals, plastics, etc. Most of those are carbon dioxide. And when we take all of that on-farm fuel and energy use and those emissions and add those to the emissions from the production of farm inputs, most of that being CO2, we have about just under 1/3 of total agricultural emissions if we aggregate it that way. The second big category is nitrogen fertilizer production and use. And we'll see that in the graph in a minute. We're looking at about a little more than a quarter of our emissions are coming from nitrogen fertilizer production and use. And that's mainly nitrous oxide from soil, carbon dioxide from nitrogen fertilizer plants, and some methane. Because nitrogen fertilizer is essentially a fossil fuel product, there's a lot of upstream methane emissions from the production of that natural gas. And then the last big category is cattle. About 1/3 of emissions in agriculture come from cattle, both enteric emissions out of their mouths when they digest grass and forage, and emissions from manure. And that's largely methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide.
So this is an overview of the emissions and the large categories. And I'll just walk people through a little bit of what's come before this analysis to give you a sense of why we thought we had to do a comprehensive and fine-grained analysis of emissions. When the NFU started working on emissions, we started working in Manitoba, and this graph is an example of what we were seeing. We were seeing emissions reported in about 6 categories. Now, just to be clear, Environment and Climate Change Canada do create data in many more categories than this, but most of the depictions that we were seeing from government, from NGOs and others, really didn't provide the kind of detail that we needed. So this is a graph from 2019, I believe, and it shows emissions in 6 categories. And you can see there's not much detail here. There's a category in the middle called direct N2O soil, and that really lumps together all the emissions from natural nitrous oxide, from fertilizer, from manure, etc. So clearly, if you're going to do policy development, you need a much more fine-grained analysis than this. And the other problem with these kinds of analyses that were quite common before the NFU started doing its work is that a lot of things are omitted here. There's no emissions from the production of machinery, no emissions from the production of fertilizers, and there's nothing here for farm fuel, for diesel, for gasoline, etc. So not only did it lack the detail we needed to develop policies, it also just omitted a bunch of categories, and thus we couldn't really see what was happening in agricultural emissions overall. So to deal with that, when the NFU was putting together its tackling report, we set out to improve upon this and come up with a more fine-grained analysis that had more categories. And that's what this looks like, or that's what it looked like here. This is the emissions graph from the tackling report. And you can see it has about a dozen different categories. In addition to the ones that were in the previous graph, we added several for fuel use, and we added machinery manufacturing, and we added fertilizer and chemical production. And this was a real step forward because for the first time in one place, we had all the different categories, and we were confident that the top line in the graph actually represented the total emissions in agriculture, unlike a lot of the other ones, which were just a subset of emissions. But even this turned out not to be nearly detailed enough. And that's why we set out in late 2021 to create a really detailed version. And that's the graph you see in front of you here. So just some insights about that graph before we zoom in and go category by category. The first insight is that emissions are increasing. So I hope you can see on the top of that graph, mine's a little bit covered up by some zoom details here, but the top line on that graph is going up quite significantly. Emissions were about 66 million tons in 1990, and they're about 84 million tons now. Second insight is that it's nitrogen fertilizer use that is driving the increase, the upward trend in that top line. So if you look at the green bands near the middle of this graph, there's kind of a medium green band, then some light green, and then kind of an olive green. You can see how those nitrogen fertilizer emissions start out relatively modest in 1990 and get wider and wider as we move forward. Part of what's happening there is that farmers have doubled the tonnage of nitrogen fertilizer that they apply in 2019 compared to 1990, a very rapid increase in nitrogen fertilizer use. Another insight here is that cattle are the largest source of emissions. So if you look at the blue bands near the bottom, there's 4 of them. The large area, kind of medium blue, that's enteric emissions from beef cattle. Then above that is a darker blue band, that's enteric emissions from dairy cattle. And then there's 2 more bands that represent emissions from manure from cattle. The fourth insight is that emissions from cattle are declining. And you can see that emissions peaked in about 2005 and have been coming down ever since. And the fifth thing I'll say is, despite the fact they're declining, there's another thing that we need to think about here, and that is the boundary around cattle emissions are not clear. So in this graph, we've labeled the bottom 4 bands as cattle. So we've got the enteric emissions out of their mouths when they digest grass and the manure emissions. But one could, if you wanted, also assign emissions from just about every category, from that nitrogen fertilizer category, because some of that nitrogen fertilizer grows feed grain, and those farm fuel categories at the top, some of that. So in the report, we're careful not to be negative around cattle production, but it's also important to get a sense of just the magnitude of those emissions. And one point we make in the report is that it's difficult to compartmentalize these things, because just about every category there, some portion of that could be counted in that cattle emissions category. The sixth insight that we have and that we've included in the report is that there are some interpretive issues around cattle emissions that make it a little bit hard to make definitive statements around that. One of the things is, unlike a lot of aspects of agriculture, cattle emissions can be seen as quite natural, a natural part of the ecosystem. There has been methane producing ruminant herbivores on the landscape literally for millions of years. And cattle are now filling that role. There might be a few more of them than there has been historically, but it is the case that cattle are a natural part of Earth's biosphere. And the other thing too is there are natural methane sinks in the biosphere that break down that methane. So while it's true that cattle emissions are high, it's also true that we should probably think of them a little bit differently than we think of things like fossil fuel emissions. The next insight is that emissions from other livestock appear small, but they may not be nearly as small as they appear. So in this graph, and I hope you can see my cursor moving here, there's some blue bands right below nitrogen fertilizer, and that's the emissions from the manure from other livestock, from poultry, from hogs, from sheep, goats, buffalo, etc., and also their enteric emissions. And that looks fairly small. But similar to the point I made with cattle, probably the majority of the emissions from those other livestock, from poultry, from hogs, are really hidden in the rest of that graph. A lot of the feed grains that go into those poultry production systems and those hog production systems are grown using huge amounts of nitrogen fertilizer. So some of those nitrogen fertilizer emissions could actually be interpreted as part of emissions from other livestock like poultry and hog production systems. Same is true with fuel, etc. The second last point there, input manufacture, fuel use, and therefore CO2 are larger factors than previously understood. When we did the tackling report, we used certain data and we calculated that about 11% of agricultural emissions were related to fuel use. We've looked at new data, we've worked with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and rather than 11%, we're now seeing about 17% of emissions are related to fossil fuel use, on-farm energy use. And then if we add to that the fossil fuels that are being used to produce inputs, we find that almost a third of the total emissions coming out of agriculture are a result of fossil fuel combustion and other fossil fuel processes. And that's a large amount, a third. So when we did our analysis in 2019, we sort of deprioritized fossil fuels, but we're now coming to understand that fossil fuels and the CO2 from fossil fuels really are a more important part of this equation than we thought. And even going further than that, they might be the place where we can get the largest emission reductions in the long term. So if you think about enteric emissions from cattle, it's challenging to figure out how you would reduce those by, say, 20%. And when you think about nitrogen fertilizer, you might be able to reduce emissions by 30%, but you couldn't reduce it by 50 or 60%. But when it comes to fossil fuel emissions, the CO2 out of fossil fuel, over the medium and long term, we might be able to reduce those emissions very, very dramatically, 60, 70, 80% or more. Now, initially, those reductions will come from buildings, better insulation, replacing fossil fuels with electricity, and only much later will that come from replacing fossil fuels in machinery. But over the very long term, we probably will have to shift our focus quite a bit to fossil fuels and the CO2 coming out of fossil fuels. And then the last point here is that nitrogen-related emissions may be even higher than these graphs show. So you can see the green bands here, that represents nitrogen emissions. They're a little over a quarter of the total. But above that, there's some brown bands here. I hope you can see my cursor moving. Category 5H, 5G and 5H. Those are, sorry, we're up a little too high. That's in here. That's crop residue decomposition. So that's emissions of nitrous oxide from the straw and chaff that's left in the field. And when that decomposes, it gives off nitrous oxide. But some of that could probably legitimately be counted under nitrogen fertilizer because it's the nitrogen fertilizer that supplies the N in the N2O that eventually comes out of that crop residue decomposition. So if you segmented that and applied some of it to manure, some of it to natural processes, and some of it to nitrogen fertilizer, those nitrogen fertilizer numbers might be larger. And we're asking Environment and Climate Change Canada if they might want to do that. So that's something that we might want to look at in the future. Something else we might want to look at, although I don't think we change the categorization, but it's worth thinking about for a minute. Even some of those manure-related emissions could be thought of as emissions from nitrogen fertilizer. When manure gives off nitrous oxide, N2O, a lot of that nitrous oxide has the N in that nitrous oxide has its original source in nitrogen fertilizer. So if you think of a crop being grown, fertilized heavily with N, and then that crop is fed to hogs or chickens, say, and those hogs and chickens, when they manure, that manure later gives off nitrous oxide. The question is, what's the source of the N in that N2O? Well, it's in many cases, it's nitrogen fertilizer. And while we might not want to categorize that as nitrogen fertilizer, it's still revealing to think that because we're pushing in millions of tons of nitrogen, reactive nitrogen into one end of the farm production system in Canada, that nitrogen is spilling out in a whole bunch of different ways all throughout that system. Some of it in manure, some of it directly from soils, some of it from crop decomposition. So it's a boundary issue. Just as it's difficult to say where the boundary is between cattle and everything else, it's also difficult to say where the boundary is between nitrogen fertilizer and everything else. So those are some high level takeaways from this. And before I get into the more detailed analysis of the graph categories, maybe I'll just pause again to ask if there's any technical questions in the chat.
There's a few here, Darrin, and I think you may have covered some of them. One of them was why the focus on family farms and cattle in contrast to corporate industrial hog operations with large lagoons, manure lagoons. And another one was with the newer and cleaner generation of farm tractors, combines, and sprayers, why do emissions continue to increase? And another one was, does the carbon output for synthetic fertilizer include production?
Okay. In reverse order, the fertilizer bands here in green, the bottom three are from the soil, and then there's some up here, and we're going to go through these in detail, that are production. So we've got CO2 from fertilizer factories. We've also taken into account methane from the upstream natural gas that goes into fertilizer factories, and we have some CO2 emissions from transport from the fertilizer factories to the fertilizer retailers and then on to the farm. We don't count anything after the farm gate, but we have some transportation emissions. So we've done something that nobody else has done, in that we've tried very hard to capture all the fertilizer production emissions. Second last question was around tractors. It's a good question. All I can say is that we're taking our emissions data for fuel use, diesel fuel use, for instance, from Environment and Climate Change Canada, and they indicate that they've got a pretty low uncertainty around those. But the question is a good one about more fuel efficient machinery. It could just be that those sprayers are making a lot of passes. Those combines with 400, 500, 600 horsepower are pretty thirsty. But it's a good question. I'll look into that when we're working with Environment and Climate Change Canada. And just in terms of family farm cattle versus factory farm hogs and chickens, I'm not actually focusing on one versus the other. This is just the full range of all the emissions that Environment and Climate Change Canada reports. Essentially, we just wanted to include all the emissions, and this is what they look like when you graph them. Thanks for the question. So just to go through these one at a time, and I'll have to do it fairly quickly because we've got about 15 to 20 minutes left. So just starting at the bottom here at 2A, this big area is enteric emissions from beef cattle. So this is the methane that comes out of cattle's mouths, out of their stomachs, when that symbiotic bacteria works in the gut to break down the cellulose and related compounds in grass and forage. So that's beef cattle. Above that, category 2B, we've got the same kind of thing from dairy cattle, enteric methane. You'll see that that bottom category has gone down quite a bit. It peaked in 2005 and has been declining ever since. Dairy has stayed about the same. Then we've got two categories here, 2C and 2D. That's the manure from beef cattle and dairy cattle. That's handled dry. So most of that manure is emitting nitrous oxide. Just to get into weeds for 1 second, when manure is handled dry, it primarily releases nitrous oxide. When it's handled wet, thus the bacteria and the manure is in an anaerobic environment, it gives off methane. You know, you've heard of swamp gas, methane. Wet environments, decomposition in wet environments tends to give off methane, CH4, which, as I said before, is can more or less be used synonymously with natural gas. That's why biodigesters on farms work well, because essentially they're harnessing anaerobic decomposition to give off something that's very comparable to natural gas. Then we've got some categories here, 2E, 2F, 2G, 2H, 2I, the categories in here. That's largely emissions that you can directly attribute to other livestock. So that would be some enteric emissions, although there's not many of those from other livestock, certainly not from chickens, not from pigs, but from bison and sheep and goats to some extent, and then manure emissions from all those other livestock. So that takes us to the top of the blue bands, and that's the enteric and manure emissions from livestock. Then we get into these green bands, and really a lot of the reason that we embarked on this was driven by a desire to really understand in a fundamental way what's happening with nitrogen fertilizer, and to break that down into as detailed a picture as we can. So we start here with category, just make sure I'm in the right place here, 3A. 3A is here. This is 3A here, and that is labeled soils, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, direct. So that is when you put nitrogen fertilizer, synthetic nitrogen like urea or anhydrous ammonia or UAN into the ground, by increasing the amount of nitrogen in the soil, that increases the nitrous oxide, the N2O emissions out of the soil. So, right, you know, you put down fertilizer in April, and maybe you get a rainstorm in April or May, that ground's very wet, the N2O production goes up quite dramatically, and you get, as a result of that fertilizer, you get a spike in N2O emissions. That some of the N in that fertilizer turns into N2O, goes out, is a greenhouse gas 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. Above that, you've got this band here, 3B. That's again emissions from fertilizer, but those are indirect emissions. So some of that fertilizer turns directly into N2O, but some turns into ammonia, which isn't a greenhouse gas, or nitrogen oxides, which aren't a greenhouse gas, or nitrates, which again isn't a greenhouse gas. And those move either through the air or through surface water or through groundwater, end up somewhere else, and then give off nitrous oxide. And those are called indirect emissions. And sometimes those indirect emissions can occur tens or hundreds of kilometers away from the field. And in some cases, as in when it leaches into groundwater, it might occur years later. So those are indirect emissions, emissions that, if you put a tower over a field and we're measuring the nitrous oxide, you wouldn't pick this up, but those emissions might come from a nearby lake or out of the groundwater somewhere, or they might even move through the air tens or hundreds of kilometers, be deposited somewhere else and produce emissions in a forest somewhere, for instance. 3C is an interesting category. That's here. It's quite large, several million tons. That is urea fertilizer application, and that isn't nitrous oxide. That is carbon dioxide. Fertilizer plants produce a lot of carbon dioxide, and they emit a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and we're going to see that in a moment in category 3E. But before we get there, this is a category of carbon dioxide coming out of urea fertilizer. So to make urea, you have to put carbon into the fertilizer. So you take some of that CO2 that would otherwise be vented, and you combine it with ammonia to make urea. So you've got a fertilizer now that contains a C, that contains a carbon. You put that urea into the ground, and when it gets wet, it undergoes a reaction in the soil that actually releases CO2. So rather than the CO2 coming directly out of the fertilizer factory, the CO2 is captured at the factory, put into the urea, put into the ground, and then released later as CO2. And the same is true for UAN, urea ammonium nitrate, which is a blend of urea, and that's captured in category 3D, and that's up here. And then we get into the real emissions from input manufacture. So 3E here is labeled input manufacture and fertilizer. That is the carbon dioxide that comes out of fertilizer factories. And those of you who heard me talk about nitrogen before have heard me say things like, to note that in Manitoba, for instance, the biggest single source of greenhouse gases in the entire province is a fertilizer factory, the Koch brothers plant at Brandon. These plants can give off huge amounts of greenhouse gases. I'll just explain how that happens. In order to make ammonia, which is NH3, you need a lot of H's, a lot of hydrogens. And where do you get hydrogen? You take natural gas, which is CH4, and you cleave off the H's and put them into the ammonia, and you're left with a lot of C's, a lot of carbon. And when you release that, it turns into carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas. They vent it into the atmosphere. Some of it they capture to make urea, etc., but a lot of it is vented, and that's what we're seeing here in this large category 3E. Some nitrous oxide, but we'll just leave that detail aside for now.
Hi, Darrin.
And then,
just
yeah.
About 10 minutes left.
Okay. Couple more categories here. We've got 3F, which is here. We took account of the upstream emissions from the production of natural gas that goes into those fertilizer factories. And then a category that's so small you almost can't see it. It's 3G, and that's the transport of fertilizer from the fertilizer factory to the retailer and then onto the farm. So I'll just zoom in to another slide here. I'm just gonna skip past a lot of these fives. There are a lot of categories around crop residue decomposition and other sort of natural and semi-natural processes and adjustments, etc. If you are interested in those, we detail each one of these in a separate section in the report. I invite you to look at that. And I'll just go up to the top here, and that's the section here on farm fuel. The big one at the bottom, 8A, is diesel fuel use. We've only got off-road here, but in thinking about this and talking to various people, we decided that the on-road fuel use would be negligible because we're not counting any of the trucking past the farm gate, even where that occurs with a farmer's own truck. So there's a little bit of fuel where farmers are maybe hauling from the field, but even that might be negligible because that might be already captured in the off-road. So I think this is a pretty complete picture of the emissions from diesel. Then we've got gasoline is 8B, a little narrower here. Another one here, fuel oil, not very wide. Then we've got a fairly wide one up here, second from the top, which is 8D, natural gas and propane. And then at the top, just a narrow band that represents the emissions from the fossil fuel burning electricity generation plants that produce electricity for farmers in places like Saskatchewan, where we burn a lot of fossil fuels to make our electricity. So I think this is the last or the second last slide. And I just want to draw your attention down to the bottom. So we've talked about emissions so far, but when talking about emissions, a lot of people want to bring into the conversation soil carbon sequestration, and maybe they want to net out sequestration against emissions and come up with a measure of net emissions. We don't think that that's a good idea, and we think that emissions are very different than soil carbon sequestration and desequestration. And we go into some detail in the report. Briefly, soil carbon sequestration is an easily reversible process. And we give an example in the report. If you think about a piece of land, say in northern prairies in the 1940s being created out of forest. So you had a piece of forest in the late 1940s, you cut down the forest, you break the land, that land starts releasing CO2. It's desequestering carbon. And it'll keep desequestering carbon for quite a long time. The farmer farms it, maybe it stabilizes, maybe 3 decades later, for one reason or another, the farmer puts it into hay. Well, now potentially that land could start gaining carbon, start sequestering carbon. And it does that for a while, and then it's broken up, and then it starts losing carbon. It's desequestering again. You've reversed the process. And then maybe the farmer farms it with summer fallow for a while, and the carbon levels fall. And then maybe the farmer stops summer fallowing and goes to zero till. And now the soil carbon levels are rising. It's sequestering again. So that can be reversed over and over and over again, and even 1 year to the next. So these are very reversible processes. So we don't even call this emissions. When we've got carbon dioxide coming out of the soil, we've chosen to call that desequestration because it's a much different process than emissions. Emissions are largely non-reversible. So we've got 4 categories and a total at the bottom. 1A is here, change in summer fallow. Because farmers have stopped summer fallowing, there's a lot of carbon and carbon dioxide going from the atmosphere into the soil, about 7 or 8 million tons per year. That's this line down here. And then tillage is the one that gets talked. Oh, sorry, I got that wrong. This is summer fallow here. This one's tillage. And that's the one that gets talked about quite a bit. We're looking at about 5 or so million tons per year in soil carbon sequestration due to tillage. 1C is this one here that goes from positive to negative back to positive. So it's desequestering carbon. Here we're sequestering carbon. And again, here we're desequestering it. That is the shift in annuals versus perennials. Down here, farmers were shifting quite rapidly to perennials. And then here they're shifting from perennials, so breaking up those perennials and moving to annuals. So you've got a flow of carbon and carbon dioxide from the soil. Here the flow is to the soil, and here it's from the soil. And you can see these 2 reversals here. And that's why we don't think that these should actually be treated in the same way as emissions because of the reversibility. Land converted to cropland, that's up here. This is desequestration. caused by the creation of new farmland, mostly from forests. And then this bolder gray line that I'm tracing here with my cursor, it starts up here, just about 8 million tons of desequestration, and then it goes all the way down here to about, looks like what, about 13 or 14 million tons of sequestration. Then it's moving upward. That's the total of those other four. So the takeaway here is from about 2010 until now, that sequestration effect has been weakening. It's trending upward. It's trending towards zero. There's probably going to be a time in the near future where net sequestration reaches zero. And I'll add to that one thing that's not taken into account here is desequestration due to wetlands destruction. And in talking to experts, they estimate that's about 3 to 4 million tons per year, which is a huge number. That's almost as much as reduced tillage is sequestering. The destruction of wetlands are desequestering. So if you took that wetlands destruction on agricultural land into account, and maybe took into account the destruction of tree rows and shelter belts, this point right here, rather than being about 5 million tons per year of sequestration, might be closer to zero. So that's not to take anything away from just how critically important it is to get more carbon and more organic matter into soil. That's super important. It means that the soil absorbs water, it's healthier. Just there's a dozen really, really good reasons to build up soil carbon and organic matter. It's just that there's no version of the future where things like sequestration get to be of such a large magnitude that they offset more than a few percent. And you know, going further, as I've said, I don't even think we should see them as offsetting, but those who would have us go down that path, that's never going to be a large factor, even if we agreed to do that. Again, this is the main graph. I invite you to look at the report. There's a lot of detail in there, and there's a lot of information about the sources. Most of these numbers came from Environment and Climate Change Canada. Here's a look at the table in the report that lists all the numbers, various years, 1990, 1995, 2000, et cetera, all the way up to 2019. And the table also tells you what percentage of the total those numbers make up out of the total of about 84 million tons per year. So I hope I've come in on time. That wraps up my presentation. I invite you to read this report, which will be finished and public in the second half of March. And while you wait for that, if you haven't read the tackling report or the Imagine If report or our report to Environment and Climate Change Canada on their proposed offset scheme, you might want to have a look at those. And again, we'll get that emissions report out to you in 10 days or so once we make it public. Thanks, everyone. Look forward to questions.
Thank you, Darrin, for the presentation and all the work that has gone and will go into the writing of this report.